The Millionaire CEO saw a little girl shivering face to the wall, but what he discovered next changed everything. It was December 15th, 2023, in a quiet town in western Canada, where thick snow blanketed the streets and the cold wind whispered through the empty alleys. The temperature had dropped below -10, and the world outside looked frozen in silence. As people hurried to their warm homes, one woman, a successful CEO named Mrs. Anderson, drove slowly through the lonely road after a long business meeting. Her car's headlights cut through the foggy air and soft music played on the radio, but something suddenly caught her eye, a small figure standing motionless near an old bakery wall. She slowed down, her heartbeat rising, unsure of what she was seeing. In the dim light, she noticed a little girl barely 8 years old facing the wall, trembling in the cold. The sight sent a chill through her heart, and at that very moment, she knew something was terribly wrong. Mrs. Anderson quickly pulled her car to the side of the road, her hands trembling slightly as she turned off the engine. The snow continued to fall softly, each flake glistening under the dim streetlight, but all she could see was the fragile shadow of that small girl standing helplessly in the cold. She stepped out of the car, the icy air biting her cheeks as her heels sank into the thick snow. Every step she took toward the little girl felt heavier, her heart pounding louder with every breath. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice gentle but filled with concern. The girl didn't move. She stood there, her thin sweater soaked from the falling snow, her tiny shoulders shaking as if the world had forgotten her existence. Mrs. Anderson bent down to her level, her eyes searching for a glimpse of her face, but the child kept looking at the wall, clutching an old teddy bear so tightly it seemed to be her only comfort in the world. The bear's fur was worn, one eye missing, but it was clear it was her only friend. Mrs. Anderson reached out slowly, afraid that a sudden move might scare the child away. "It's okay, you're safe now," she whispered, trying to sound calm even though her voice trembled with emotion. The little girl finally turned her head just enough for Mrs. Anderson to see her pale cheeks and red nose. Her lips were blue from the cold, and her big brown eyes held a sadness that words could never describe. She didn't speak, not even a single sound, just looked up with a silent plea for help. Mrs. Anderson took off her warm scarf and wrapped it around the child's neck, feeling the coldness of her tiny hands through the fabric. "Where is your mother?" she asked softly, but the girl only shook her head and looked down at her snow-covered boots. There was something haunting about the silence, something that made Mrs. Anderson's chest tighten. The street around them was empty, the only sound being the wind howling through the narrow lane. She looked around, hoping to see someone nearby, but there was no one. The bakery was closed, the windows frosted over, and not a single light flickered in the distance. It was as if the world had turned its back on this child. Mrs. Anderson knelt in the snow, ignoring the cold seeping through her coat, and gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "You don't have to be afraid," she whispered again, trying to catch her gaze. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she still didn't speak. Her small body trembled uncontrollably, and Mrs. Anderson realized that if she stayed there any longer, she might not survive the night. Without thinking twice, she stood up, removed her coat, and wrapped it around the child, pulling her close to share her own warmth. The little girl finally leaned in, her head resting against Mrs. Anderson's chest as if she had been waiting for someone to hold her all along. In that moment, the snow didn't matter, the cold didn't matter, and the silence didn't matter. All that mattered was the faint heartbeat of a forgotten child now finding comfort in the arms of a stranger. Mrs. Anderson held the little girl close, feeling her fragile body shiver against her chest, and in that still moment she sensed a sadness deeper than the cold itself. The child's silence spoke louder than any words could, and when Mrs. Anderson finally turned her fully around, she saw the frozen tears clinging to her tiny cheeks like small crystals of pain. Her eyelashes were stiff from the frost, and her lips trembled as if she wanted to say something but didn't have the strength. Mrs. Anderson brushed away the snow from her hair and whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart, you're safe now." But her voice broke as she said it. She adjusted her coat around the girl and felt something pressed between the teddy bear's arm and her chest. It was a small folded note, damp from the snow yet carefully pinned to the toy. Her hand shook as she unpinned it, the ink slightly smudged, but the message was still clear enough to pierce straight through her heart. It read, "Please take care of her. I can't afford to feed her anymore. I'm sorry." For a second, Mrs. Anderson couldn't breathe. The weight of those words hit her harder than the freezing wind. She looked down at the girl, who now stared at the ground, her tiny fingers gripping the teddy bear tighter, as if afraid someone might take it away too. Mrs. Anderson's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them before they could fall. She didn't want the child to see her cry, but inside her heart was breaking. How could a mother be so desperate to leave her child like this? Yet as she thought about it, she realized it wasn't cruelty, it was despair. Somewhere out there, a mother had made the most painful decision a human being could ever make, believing this was her only chance to save her daughter. Mrs. Anderson felt an ache deep within her soul. She had seen poverty in the news, but this was different. This was real, right in front of her eyes. The snow kept falling, covering the ground like a white blanket, but the world felt darker than ever. She carefully folded the note and placed it in her pocket, promising herself she would never let this child feel alone again. The girl looked up timidly, her eyes wide with confusion and fear, and whispered for the first time, "Is my mommy coming back?" The question shattered what little composure Mrs. Anderson had left. She knelt again, her voice trembling but tender as she replied, "I don't know, my dear, but I promise you will never be alone again." The little girl nodded faintly, her tears mixing with the snowflakes falling on her face. Mrs. Anderson hugged her tighter, trying to shelter her from the biting wind. In that moment, she no longer felt like a stranger helping a lost child. She felt like a guardian standing at the edge of a broken world, holding a piece of its innocence. She glanced toward the endless road disappearing into the storm, her heart heavy with the question of what kind of pain could drive a mother to this point. But she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had found this girl for a reason, and she was not going to let her go. Mrs. Anderson lifted the little girl gently into her arms, feeling how light she was as if the cold had taken away all her strength. She carried her to the car, opened the back door, and carefully placed her on the warm seat. The heater hummed softly, filling the space with a gentle warmth that slowly replaced the biting chill of the snow outside. Mrs. Anderson reached for a thermos she always kept for long drives, poured some hot chocolate into the cup, and handed it to the girl. The child hesitated for a moment, her hands trembling before taking a small sip. Her eyes softened slightly as the warmth spread through her tiny body, and for the first time Mrs. Anderson saw a flicker of life return to her pale face. Watching her, something inside Mrs. Anderson shifted. She had spent her whole life building her company, chasing success, earning respect, but never once had she felt this kind of purpose. The girl looked fragile, yet there was a quiet strength in her eyes that touched something deep in her heart. As they drove toward the nearest shelter, snow continued to fall, blurring the world outside into white silence. Mrs. Anderson glanced at the little girl through the rearview mirror. She had fallen asleep, still clutching her teddy bear tightly against her chest. That sight pierced through every wall of professionalism Mrs. Anderson had ever built around her heart. She realized this wasn't a random encounter. It was something meant to happen. When they reached the shelter, Mrs. Anderson carried the girl inside, where a kind-looking woman greeted them with concern. She explained the situation quickly, showing the note she had found. The woman gasped softly, her eyes filled with pity, and guided the child to a small bed in the corner. As Mrs. Anderson watched the little girl curl up beneath a warm blanket, she felt a strange ache, a fear of walking away. She knew she could return to her mansion, to her glass walls and silent rooms, but would she ever sleep peacefully knowing this child might grow up without love? That thought was unbearable. She stepped outside to call the police and social services, explaining everything in a calm but emotional voice. She wanted to make sure the girl was safe and protected, that everything was done properly. When the officer on the phone thanked her for doing the right thing, she nodded silently, though her heart felt heavier than ever. After the call ended, she looked back through the shelter window, watching the child sleep peacefully for the first time, and at that moment, she made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. She decided to adopt her, to give her a home, a family, and a life filled with warmth and security. It wasn't pity that moved her. It was love, pure and undeniable. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "You're mine now, little one." And as the snow fell endlessly outside, Mrs. Anderson felt something she hadn't felt in years, a quiet, powerful sense of hope. A year later, the same street lay beneath a soft white blanket of snow, but everything had changed. The cold no longer carried loneliness. It carried laughter. The little girl, now healthy and full of life, ran across the snow with her new mother, Mrs. Anderson, their footprints weaving together like a memory that could never fade. The once quiet CEO now found joy in the sound of small giggles and the warmth of tiny hands holding hers. Whenever people asked about that night, she would smile and say softly, "That day I didn't rescue a child, she rescued me." The girl had given her heart a reason to feel again, a reminder that love can appear when least expected. As the wind whispered through the trees, Mrs. Anderson looked at the child and realized that sometimes the smallest souls bring the greatest miracles. And so their story began again, with love, not loneliness.